James Foster stood at the edge of his meticulously maintained property, staring at the storage facility that had been his pride and joy for years. The sleek, custom-built structure housed not only his collection of rare antiques but also sensitive business records and personal keepsakes. To James, this facility was more than just a storage unit. It was a fortress protecting everything he had worked tirelessly to accumulate over the years. His home was his sanctuary, his business was his legacy, and the storage facility symbolized the bridge between the two. But today something was wrong. The morning air felt unusually heavy as he approached the facility. At first he thought it was his imagination, some vague paranoia creeping in from a restless night. Then he saw that the locks on the doors were not his. They had been replaced with heavy-duty padlocks he did not recognize. A laminated sign taped to the metal door caught his attention. It read "Access lease to authorized renters. For inquiries, contact the management office." The bold print and impersonal tone of the message hit him like a slap in the face. James froze. For a moment he thought it might be a mistake, a mix-up perhaps with the management of another property. But this was his private storage, located on his own land, and no one else had the right to touch it. His name was on the title, and every square foot of the property had been painstakingly maintained and secured by him alone. The thought of someone accessing his personal belongings, let alone leasing them out to strangers, sent a chill down his spine. Pulling out his phone, he dialed the management office of the neighborhood association. He didn't have high hopes for a productive conversation, given his history of clashing with their overbearing leadership. Still, he needed answers. After several minutes of holding, a chipper yet condescending voice finally answered. "Good morning. Neighborhood Management Office, this is Valerie speaking. How can I help you?" "This is James Foster," he said, his voice steady but laced with controlled irritation. "I'm standing in front of my private storage facility, and it seems someone has changed the locks and posted a notice about leased access. I'd like an explanation immediately." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the unmistakable sound of keyboard clicks. "Ah, Mr. Foster," Valerie said in a tone that made it clear she knew exactly who he was. "I believe this is related to a recent update to our property use bylaws. Let me check the details for you." James clenched his jaw as he waited, the seconds stretching into an unbearable silence. Finally, Valerie spoke again, her voice light as if she were discussing the weather. "Yes, it seems the storage facility on your property has been designated as part of the Community Resource Program. Under the new guidelines, such spaces can be made available for shared use if they meet specific criteria. This allows renters within the neighborhood to have access to additional storage space, enhancing community collaboration." James stared at the laminated sign again, the words "leased access" burning into his mind. "Enhancing community collaboration," he repeated, his voice sharp. "This is my property. I did not consent to this, and no one notified me of any changes. Who authorized this?" "The adjustments to the bylaws were passed at the last association meeting," Valerie said smoothly. "Notices were sent out to all property owners." "I received no such notice," James shot back. "Even if I had, you can't just decide to hand over my private property to strangers. This is theft, plain and simple." Valerie sighed, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Mr. Foster, I understand your frustration, but the association operates within its legal rights. If you have concerns, you are welcome to submit them in writing for review by the board." James hung up without another word, his chest tight with fury. Submit concerns in writing? The sheer arrogance of their response was almost laughable. This was not some minor infraction like a noise complaint or a dispute over landscaping. This was an outright violation of his property rights. Determined to get to the bottom of the situation, James inspected the facility more closely. The locks were industrial grade, clearly installed by professionals. Peering through the small window on the side of the structure, he could see evidence that the interior had been disturbed. Boxes were moved, shelves disorganized, and there was even a piece of furniture he didn't recognize. Someone had not only entered his storage but had started using it as if it were their own. Rushing back to his house, James retrieved the master folder where he kept all documents related to his property. He spread out the blueprints, deeds, and receipts on the dining table, meticulously scanning every detail to ensure there was no loophole that could justify what had been done. It was all there in black and white. The land was his, the facility was his, and there was no legal basis for anyone else to have access. As the hours passed, his anger turned to unease. If the association was bold enough to unilaterally seize his property for their so-called community resource program, what else were they capable of? James thought of the rare items stored inside antique furniture, historical documents, one-of-a-kind collectibles. Some of these pieces were irreplaceable, both in value and personal significance. He pulled out a flashlight and returned to the facility after nightfall, determined to gather more evidence. Carefully scanning the perimeter, he noticed faint tire tracks in the gravel leading to the back entrance. Whoever had been here had likely used a vehicle to transport items. He also found discarded zip ties and packaging materials, further proof that someone had been handling his belongings. By the time he returned home, James knew one thing for certain: this was not going to end with a polite letter to the board. Someone had crossed a line, and he would make sure they regretted it. As he locked the doors and turned off the lights, a singular thought kept echoing in his mind. They'd underestimated him. The next morning, James Foster sat at his kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. The events of the previous day played over and over in his mind like a bad dream. The locks, the notice, the dismissive tone of the association's representative, everything pointed to one undeniable truth: someone had deliberately crossed a line. He wasn't sure what infuriated him more, the violation of his personal space or the smug indifference of the management office. But he knew one thing: he couldn't afford to sit idly by. This was his property, his life's work, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. Determined to take action, James called his attorney, Greg Matheson, a no-nonsense litigator who had helped him navigate complex real estate issues in the past. When Greg answered, James wasted no time diving into the details, recounting the situation with the precision of someone accustomed to handling high-stakes negotiations. "So let me get this straight," Greg said after a pause. "The association claims they've leased access to your storage facility under some newly amended bylaws, but you never consented to this, and you were never notified." "Exactly," James replied, his voice tight. "They're treating it as if they have some blanket authority over my private property. They even replaced the locks without telling me." Greg sighed. "This is highly unusual, James. Private property rights are protected under state law, and no association has the authority to lease out property they don't own. Did you keep the notice they posted?" "Yes, I have it right here," James said, glancing at the crumpled sign on his counter. "Good. We'll need that as evidence. But here's the thing: you're going to have to act quickly. If they've already granted access to third parties, there's no telling what's been done to your belongings. I'll draft a cease and desist letter today. But you'll need to gather as much evidence as possible on your end. Pictures, records, anything that proves your ownership and shows the state of the property." "I already checked my documents last night," James said. "The facility is explicitly listed as part of my property in the deed. There's no way they can justify this." "Perfect," Greg replied. "Send me copies of everything. I'll start the paperwork. In the meantime, stay alert. If they're bold enough to pull something like this, they might try to cover their tracks." After hanging up, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was focused. Grabbing his camera, he walked back to the storage facility to document everything. He took pictures of the new locks, the tire tracks in the gravel, and the interior of the facility through the window. Even though it was difficult to see everything inside, the disarray was clear enough to capture in photos. As he worked, a black SUV pulled up on the side of the road. The windows were tinted, and the vehicle idled for a moment before slowly driving away. James tensed. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Was it someone from the association? Or perhaps one of the so-called authorized renters? Either way, he knew he needed to escalate his security measures. Later that afternoon, James visited the local hardware store and purchased a new set of industrial-grade locks. He also picked up motion sensor cameras and a small floodlight. If anyone tried to access the facility again, they wouldn't go unnoticed. By evening, he had replaced the locks and installed the cameras, their red recording lights blinking ominously in the growing darkness. That night, James received a call from one of his neighbors, Carl, who lived a few houses down. Carl was an older man who rarely got involved in neighborhood politics, but his tone was unusually serious. "James, I heard about what's going on with your storage facility," Carl said. "You need to be careful." Careful of what James asked. Leaning against his kitchen counter, Carl hesitated. "There's been talk around the neighborhood about some shady deals going on with the association. A few months back, they started leasing out spaces in the community center for storage, claiming it was part of a revenue-boosting initiative, but a lot of people didn't like it, said it was poorly managed and things started going missing. Now it looks like they're trying to expand the program to private properties." James frowned. Why would they need to expand? Don't they already have enough space in the community center? "That's the thing," Carl continued. "No one knows where the money from the leasing program is going. There's been no transparency about how it's being used. Some of us think they're funneling it into personal projects or worse." James felt a cold knot form in his stomach. If what Carl was saying was true, then this wasn't just a case of overreach, it was corruption. "Thanks for the heads up, Carl," he said. "I'll keep that in mind." After hanging up, James began piecing together the puzzle. The tire tracks, the black SUV, the unexplained leasing program, it all pointed to a larger scheme. And yet, he still didn't have enough to prove anything definitively. He needed more information, but he couldn't risk confronting the association directly without solid evidence. The following day, James decided to take a different approach. He visited the local county clerk's office to request public records related to the association's recent amendments. The clerk, a friendly woman named Margaret, was more than happy to help. After a bit of searching, she handed James a stack of documents outlining the changes to the bylaws. As he skimmed through the pages, James's suspicions were confirmed. The amendments included a vague clause allowing the association to repurpose underutilized private spaces for community benefit, but there was no mention of consent from property owners. Worse, the signatures on the document were illegible, making it impossible to identify who had approved the changes. Returning home, James called Greg to update him. "It's worse than I thought," James said. "They've buried their actions under this broad language about community benefit, but there's no transparency about how they're implementing it. It's all smoke and mirrors." "That's exactly what we needed to know," Greg replied. "This language is far too vague to hold up in court. We'll include it in the cease and desist letter. In the meantime, keep an eye on your property. If anyone tries to access it again, call the police immediately." As the sun set, James felt a mix of frustration and determination. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about his storage facility, it was part of a larger pattern of exploitation and deceit. For the first time, he realized he might be up against more than just an overzealous association, and if they thought he was going to back down, they were sorely mistaken. James woke the next morning to the sound of his motion sensor camera alert chiming on his phone. Bleary-eyed, he unlocked the screen and opened the app, expecting nothing more than a stray animal triggering the sensor. Instead, what he saw sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through him. A man in a dark jacket stood in front of the storage facility, his face obscured by a baseball cap. The man was fiddling with the new locks James had installed just the day before. A second figure lingered near the edge of the frame, nervously pacing and glancing down the road. James bolted upright, his mind racing. The timestamp on the footage showed it had been recorded just 15 minutes earlier. Whoever these people were, they were bold enough to attempt access to his property in broad daylight. James quickly saved the video to his phone and dialed the local police department. As he explained the situation, he was careful to emphasize the intruder's presence on his private property and the evidence captured on camera. When the police arrived, James met them at the gate to his property and showed them the footage. The officers nodded gravely, their faces betraying a mix of concern and frustration. "Unfortunately, we can't do much unless we catch them in the act," one of them said, handing the phone back to James. "But we'll file a report, and if they come back, let us know immediately. At the very least, this will establish a record of the incidents." As the officers drove away, James felt a mix of gratitude and helplessness. The report was a start, but it wasn't going to stop whoever was behind this. He returned to the facility and inspected the new locks. They had clearly been tampered with. Scratches and scuff marks suggested the intruders had tried to force them open but failed. The cameras had done their job, but it was only a matter of time before these people returned with better tools or a more sophisticated plan. Determined to fortify his defenses, James called the security company he'd used for the camera installation and arranged for an immediate upgrade. Within hours, a technician arrived and installed additional cameras, ensuring there were no blind spots around the facility. They also set up an alert system that would notify James and the security company directly if anyone attempted to breach the locks again. Later that day, James received an unexpected knock at his door. Standing on his porch was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an air of authority. She introduced herself as Evelyn Ross, a representative of the neighborhood's management board. Her arrival felt calculated, as if she had timed it to coincide with the earlier incident. "Good afternoon, Mr. Foster," she began, her tone brisk but polite. "I understand you've raised some concerns about the recent changes to our community policies." "That's putting it mildly," James replied, crossing his arms. "Someone broke into my storage facility, and your board seems to think they have the right to lease out my private property. I'd like to know exactly what's going on." Evelyn smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I can assure you, Mr. Foster, the board's actions are entirely within the scope of the amended bylaws. The facility was classified as an underutilized asset, and its inclusion in the leasing program was approved unanimously by the board." "Unanimously, huh?" James said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And yet I never received any notification, nor did I consent to this so-called program." "Tell me, Ms. Ross, how exactly does that align with property laws?" Evelyn's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "We sent notices to all property owners months ago. Perhaps yours was misplaced. Regardless, the leasing agreements have already been signed, and any concerns you have can be addressed at the next board meeting." James clenched his fists, doing his best to keep his composure. "Let me be perfectly clear. This is my property. You had no right to touch it, let alone lease it out. I've already contacted my attorney, and if I find out that any of my belongings are missing or damaged, your board will be held fully accountable." Evelyn's expression hardened, and her voice took on a sterner tone. "Mr. Foster, I would advise you to tread carefully. The board operates under legal authority, and any interference with its programs could result in penalties or further action. Good day." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving James standing in his doorway seething. Her veiled threat only confirmed what he had suspected: this wasn't a simple bureaucratic oversight. The board's actions were deliberate, calculated, and designed to intimidate. As the days passed, James began to notice other signs that something larger was at play. One evening, while reviewing footage from his new cameras, he spotted the same black SUV from before parked further down the street. It lingered for nearly an hour before driving off, its occupants never stepping out. Another time, he found a piece of equipment, a bolt cutter, discarded near the edge of his property. It was as if someone was testing his resolve, pushing him to see how far he would go. Things came to a head when James received a letter in the mail, stamped with the board's official logo. It accused him of violating community regulations by tampering with designated shared property and imposed a hefty fine. The sheer audacity of the claim left James momentarily speechless. They were fining him for securing his own property? It was absurd, yet it fit perfectly with the board's pattern of behavior, bully tactics masquerading as official policy. James called Greg and read the letter aloud over the phone. "They're trying to wear you down," Greg said. "They want you to give up and let them do whatever they want. Don't let them get to you." "I won't," James said, his voice firm. "But this is more than just a property dispute now. They're actively trying to cover their tracks and intimidate me. We need to take this to the next level." Greg agreed, and together they drafted a formal legal complaint, demanding the immediate cessation of all leasing activities involving James's property. The complaint also requested an independent audit of the board's financial records, suspecting that the leasing program was being used to funnel money into unaccounted-for projects. By the time the complaint was filed, James felt a glimmer of hope. He was no stranger to fighting uphill battles, and this was no different. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the board wasn't just trying to exploit his property, they were hiding something much bigger. And he was determined to find out what it was. James Foster sat at his desk, staring at the neatly stacked documents in front of him. Weeks of back-and-forth battles with the board had left him exhausted, but his resolve had only hardened. The situation had escalated far beyond a mere dispute over his storage facility. Every piece of evidence he uncovered pointed to something far more sinister, a coordinated effort to exploit private property for profit under the guise of community benefit. Now, as he prepared for the legal showdown ahead, James knew the time had come to expose the full scope of what was happening. Earlier that morning, Greg Matheson, James's attorney, had called with an update. "I've secured a temporary injunction," Greg said. "This will at least prevent the board from leasing out your facility or granting access to third parties until we have our day in court. But there's more." James leaned forward, gripping the phone tightly. "What is it?" "I received an anonymous tip from someone claiming to have insider knowledge about the board's operations. They sent me a list of properties that have been similarly targeted for this so-called leasing program. Your storage facility is just one of many." The revelation hit James like a punch to the gut. "How many properties are we talking about?" "Dozens," Greg replied. "And the pattern is consistent. The board reclassifies these spaces as community assets, then quietly leases them out, often to individuals or organizations with no ties to the neighborhood. In some cases, property owners aren't even aware until the locks have been changed, just like with you." James felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. This isn't just negligence. This is theft, plain and simple. "I agree," Greg said, "but proving it will require more evidence." The tip included partial financial records that suggest the leasing fees are being funneled into private accounts tied to certain board members. If we can verify that, it's game over for them. James hung up the phone and sat in silence, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of strangers walking through his storage facility, rifling through his belongings as if they had every right to be there. The thought of other homeowners facing the same violation only strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about exposing the corruption that had taken root in his community. Later that afternoon, James decided to visit one of the other targeted properties listed in the anonymous tip. He drove to the address of a vacant house on the far side of the neighborhood. The house had been empty for months, its overgrown yard and boarded-up windows a stark contrast to the pristine home surrounding it. According to the tip, this property had been leased out as a storage site for a local contractor, despite its owner being overseas and completely unaware of the arrangement. As James approached the property, he noticed a large van parked in the driveway. Two men were unloading equipment in boxes, their movements hurried and purposeful. James parked his car a safe distance away and observed them from behind a row of hedges. It didn't take long to confirm his suspicions. The men weren't contractors working on the house. They were using it as a makeshift warehouse, stacking crates and materials in the garage with no regard for the property itself. Pulling out his phone, James discreetly recorded the activity, making sure to capture the license plate of the van. The footage would serve as valuable evidence, not just for his case but for any other homeowners facing similar violations. As he watched, one of the men paused and glanced in his direction, forcing James to duck behind the hedges. His heart raced as he waited for what felt like an eternity, but the man eventually returned to work, seemingly unaware of James's presence. Feeling a mix of triumph and unease, James left the scene and drove straight to Greg's office. He showed the attorney the footage and relayed everything he had observed. Greg's expression darkened as he reviewed the video. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "It proves that the board is not only leasing private properties without consent, but also allowing them to be used for questionable purposes. This van alone could lead us to whoever's orchestrating this operation." The next step was to dig deeper into the financial trail. Greg filed a motion to subpoena the board's financial records, citing the mounting evidence of misconduct. To bolster their case, they also reached out to other property owners on the anonymous tips list, many of whom were eager to share their own horror stories. One elderly couple revealed that they had been fined repeatedly for unapproved modifications to their garden, only to discover later that their backyard shed had been leased out without their knowledge. Another neighbor described coming home from vacation to find strangers using his driveway as a parking lot for rented vehicles. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, James couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. The board had underestimated him, assuming he would fold under their pressure. Instead, he was exposing their corruption, one step at a time. But just as the momentum seemed to shift in his favor, the board struck back. One evening, James returned home to find a letter taped to his front door. It was an official notice accusing him of harassment and defamation against the board. The letter threatened legal action if he continued to interfere with their operations. James read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each line. It was a transparent attempt to intimidate him, but it only fueled his determination. Things escalated further when James discovered a suspicious package on his doorstep. Inside was an unmarked envelope containing photos of him at the vacant property, along with a note that read, "Stay out of things that don't concern you." The threat was clear, but it only confirmed that he was on the right track. Whoever was behind this operation was starting to feel the pressure. Greg advised James to report the incident to the police, who agreed to investigate the matter. Meanwhile, James doubled down on his security measures, upgrading his cameras and installing additional locks on all access points to his property. He also began sharing updates with the other homeowners involved, forming a loose coalition of neighbors determined to hold the board accountable. The breakthrough came when one of the neighbors, a retired accountant named Linda, uncovered a crucial piece of evidence. While reviewing old community newsletters, she found a notice about the leasing program buried in the fine print of a lengthy financial report. The report included vague references to external partnerships and revenue-generating initiatives, but it also listed payments to a shell company with no clear connection to the neighborhood. Linda's discovery provided the missing link proof that the board was funneling money into illegitimate accounts. Armed with this new evidence, Greg prepared to file an updated complaint, this time targeting the board members personally. The case was no longer just about James's storage facility. It had become a battle to dismantle a system of corruption that had exploited countless homeowners. As James reviewed the documents late into the night, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't just fighting for his property, he was fighting for his community, and he wasn't going to stop until the truth came to light. James Foster woke up to the sharp beeping of his phone, another alert from the motion sensor cameras. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint orange glow through his bedroom window. Groggily, he opened the app to check the footage, expecting another minor incident. What he saw immediately shook the remnants of sleep from his mind. A group of 3 individuals stood at the edge of his storage facility, dressed in dark clothing and armed with tools. One was holding a crowbar, clearly trying to pry open the newly installed locks, while another rummaged through a bag of equipment. The third person appeared to be on lookout, scanning the area nervously. James bolted out of bed, grabbing his phone and rushing to the window to confirm they were still there. By the time he peered outside, the group had already disappeared, but the damage was done. The locks on his facility were visibly scratched and dented, and a section of the fence around the property was bent inward, as though someone had climbed over it. Heart pounding, James immediately called the police. This wasn't just intimidation anymore, this was a direct attack on his property. The dispatcher assured him that officers would be sent to his house as soon as possible. While waiting, James went outside to inspect the damage. Near the bent section of the fence, he found a dropped flashlight and a discarded pair of gloves. They were evidence, small but significant, and he carefully photographed them before placing them in a plastic bag for the authorities. When the officers arrived, James explained the situation, showing them the footage from his cameras and the items he had collected. One officer, a seasoned man with a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded grimly as he reviewed the evidence. "This isn't random vandalism," he said. "These people knew what they were doing. They were prepared." James felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you think it's connected to the management board? They've been targeting my property for weeks now." "It's possible," the officer replied, "but without direct proof, it's hard to say. We'll open an investigation and log this incident, but in the meantime, I'd recommend increasing your security even further. Whoever they are, they'll likely come back if they think they can get away with it." As the police left, James felt a sinking mixture of anger and helplessness. He had done everything right, installed cameras, secured his property, involved the authorities, and yet the attacks were only escalating. It was as though someone was testing his limits, trying to see how far they could push him before he broke. Later that afternoon, James received a call from Greg. The attorney's voice was tense, his usual calm professionalism tinged with urgency. "James, I just got a response to the subpoena for the financial records. There's something you need to see." James drove to Greg's office immediately. When he arrived, Greg handed him a folder containing spreadsheets, transaction logs, and emails between members of the management board. As James scanned the documents, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The board had been quietly channeling funds from the leasing program into a shell company called Evergreen Solutions. Payments labeled as maintenance expenses and administrative fees totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars, all directed to accounts with no clear ties to the community. "What's Evergreen Solutions?" James asked, his voice sharp. "That's the thing," Greg replied. "It's a front. The company doesn't exist outside of these transactions. I did some digging and found that the account holders are connected to two of the board members, Evelyn Ross, and another member, David Klein. This isn't just mismanagement, James. This is embezzlement." James felt a surge of vindication, tempered by the gravity of the situation. "This is the proof we needed," he said. "But it still doesn't explain why they're so desperate to target my property. Why go to these lengths just for a storage facility?" Greg hesitated. "I think your property is just a piece of a larger puzzle. The board's been using this leasing program to launder money, and your storage facility is prime real estate for their operation. They probably thought you wouldn't fight back, that they could steamroll you like everyone else." James clenched his fists. They picked the wrong person to mess with. Over the next few days, James and Greg worked tirelessly to compile their case. They filed an updated legal complaint, now including allegations of embezzlement and financial fraud. Meanwhile, James took extra precautions to protect himself and his property. He hired a private security firm to patrol the area at night and installed additional cameras with infrared sensors to catch any activity in the dark. Despite his efforts, the pressure continued to mount. One evening, James found an unmarked envelope in his mailbox. Inside was a typed note that read, "Drop the case. Walk away while you still can." No signature, no explanation, just a clear threat. James took the note straight to the police, who added it to their growing file on the case. But the intimidation tactics didn't stop there. A few nights later, James was woken by the sound of breaking glass. He grabbed a flashlight and rushed to the front of the house, where he found one of his windows shattered. On the ground below, a brick lay among the shards, tied with another note that read, "Last warning." James refused to be cowed. If anything, the attacks only strengthened his resolve. He contacted the local news station and anonymously shared details about the case, hoping to draw public attention to the board's corruption. Within days, the story gained traction, with reporters showing up at board meetings and questioning members about the allegations. Evelyn Ross and David Klein both refused to comment, their once confident facades beginning to crack under the scrutiny. At the same time, Greg uncovered another crucial piece of evidence. One of the emails in the subpoenaed records contained a list of addresses, including James's storage facility and several other targeted properties. Next to each address was a note detailing its potential value and accessibility for transport. The language was cold and clinical, clearly treating these properties as commodities to be exploited. "This is it," Greg said, showing James the email. "This proves they were targeting properties for their own gain, not for any legitimate community purpose. With this, we can bring criminal charges." As the legal battle intensified, James found himself balancing on a knife's edge. He had the evidence, the support of his attorney, and the growing attention of the public. But the board was desperate, and desperation made people dangerous. Every step forward felt like a gamble, a test of whether James could withstand the pressure long enough to see justice served. By the end of the week, the board called an emergency meeting, likely in an attempt to regroup and strategize. James knew he wouldn't be welcome, but that didn't stop him from showing up. As he stood outside the building, watching the board members file in one by one, he felt a surge of determination. They could threaten him, vandalize his property, and try to bury the truth, but they couldn't silence him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and James wasn't going anywhere. James Foster stood at the courthouse steps, the weight of months of tension pressing heavily on his shoulders. Today was the day the truth would finally come out. His attorney, Greg Matheson, had spent the past weeks meticulously building their case, armed with damning evidence of corruption, embezzlement, and illegal activity orchestrated by the board. James's fight for his storage facility had grown into something far greater, a battle to expose the rot festering beneath the surface of his community. He tightened his grip on the folder in his hand, containing every piece of evidence they had uncovered. There was no turning back now. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. On one side sat James and Greg, flanked by a small group of neighbors who had joined the fight after learning their properties had also been exploited. On the other side were the board members, including Evelyn Ross and David Klein, their confident masks now replaced with unease. They were accompanied by a team of lawyers who whispered furiously among themselves, their polished appearances unable to hide the cracks forming under pressure. The judge entered, and the room fell silent as the proceedings began. Greg opened with a blistering statement, laying out the core of their case. "Your Honor, this is not just a property dispute. This is a deliberate, calculated abuse of power by individuals entrusted to serve their community. Over the course of months, the defendants have exploited private properties, funneled money into fraudulent accounts, and used intimidation tactics to silence those who dared to stand against them. Today we intend to show the court the full scope of their actions." What followed was a methodical dismantling of the board's defenses. Greg presented the subpoenaed financial records, pointing out the payments to the shell company Evergreen Solutions and highlighting the total lack of transparency in the board's operations. He then introduced the email listing targeted properties, which left little doubt about the board's true intentions. "These are not the actions of an organization acting in good faith," Greg said. "This is organized corruption." The board's lawyers tried to deflect, arguing that the leasing program was approved under amended bylaws and that all actions were within legal boundaries. But their defense quickly fell apart under cross-examination. When asked to provide detailed explanations for the payments to Evergreen Solutions, Evelyn Ross stammered and avoided eye contact, claiming she wasn't involved in the financial decisions. Her attempt to shift blame onto David Klein only deepened the cracks in their united front. Klein, for his part, fared no better. When questioned about the note assigning potential value to James's storage facility and other properties, he claimed it was a misunderstanding and that the email had been taken out of context. Greg seized the moment, holding up printed copies of the email chain for the court to see. "A misunderstanding, Mr. Klein? These documents clearly show that you and your colleagues were treating private properties as assets to be exploited for personal gain. There's no ambiguity here." As the evidence mounted, the board's lawyers grew increasingly desperate. They attempted to dismiss the allegations of intimidation, suggesting that James had fabricated the threatening notes and vandalism to frame the board. But Greg was ready for this. He introduced the police reports, security footage, and physical evidence James had collected over the weeks, each piece meticulously cataloged and presented to the court. The footage of the intruders at the storage facility, combined with the records of the black SUV linked to the board, painted an undeniable picture of coordinated harassment. The turning point came when Greg called a surprise witness, Linda, the retired accountant who had uncovered the financial discrepancies in the board's reports. Linda's testimony was devastating. She detailed how the leasing program's revenue had been funneled through opaque accounts and how attempts to request transparency had been stonewalled by the board. "I joined the community believing that the board was there to protect our interests," she said, her voice steady but filled with quiet anger. "What I found was a group of individuals who saw our properties as opportunities to line their own pockets." By the time Greg rested his case, the courtroom was buzzing with tension. The board's lawyers tried to mount a rebuttal, but their arguments rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Even the judge seemed unimpressed, his stern gaze fixed on the defendants as they squirmed in their seats. In his closing statement, Greg drove the final nail into the coffin. This case is about more than one man's fight for his property. It's about holding those in power accountable for their actions. The defendants have betrayed the trust of this community, exploiting their neighbors for personal gain. We ask this court to send a clear message. Such actions will not be tolerated. When the judge called a recess to deliberate, James felt a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. He had done everything he could, put every ounce of effort into this fight. Now all he could do was wait. The verdict came quicker than anyone expected. When the judge returned, his tone was firm and decisive. After reviewing the evidence and testimony presented, this court finds the defendants guilty of multiple counts, including embezzlement, fraud, and unauthorized use of private property. The leasing program is hereby deemed illegal, and all affected properties are to be immediately restored to their rightful owners. Furthermore, the defendants will face fines and criminal charges as determined by the appropriate authorities. The room erupted in murmurs as the judge continued. Let this serve as a reminder to all that no one is above the law, and those entrusted with power must wield it responsibly. For the first time in months, James allowed himself to exhale. The weight on his shoulders began to lift as he realized the battle was finally over. Justice had been served. The board members were escorted out of the courtroom, their once confident facades shattered. Evelyn Ross avoided James's gaze as she was led past him, her expression a mix of anger and defeat. Outside the courthouse, James was met with handshakes and words of gratitude from the neighbors who had stood by him. For them, this victory was more than just the resolution of a legal battle, it was a reclamation of their community. As he drove home that evening, James felt a quiet sense of triumph. The road ahead would involve rebuilding, both for himself and for the neighborhood, but the hardest part was behind him. His storage facility, his property, and his peace of mind were finally safe. Most importantly, he had proven that even in the face of corruption and intimidation, standing up for what's right could make all the difference. The sun dipped low on the horizon as James Foster parked his car in the driveway, the sight of his home and storage facility finally bringing him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. The battle was over, and for the first time he could stand on his property without the weight of constant vigilance pressing down on him. The ruling from the court had not only restored his storage facility but had also sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, reshaping the power dynamics that had enabled corruption to fester. Over the following weeks, the fallout from the trial became a topic of heated discussion among the residents. Evelyn Ross and David Klein, once untouchable figures in the community, faced criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. Their assets were frozen, and their positions on the board were permanently revoked. The other board members, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, resigned en masse, leaving the association leaderless and discredited. James didn't revel in their downfall. His satisfaction came from knowing that justice had been served. Still, there was work to be done. The affected homeowners, emboldened by the court's decision, formed a new committee to reform the association and rebuild trust within the community. They reached out to James, asking him to help lead the effort. Though he was hesitant, at first preferring to focus on his own life, he eventually agreed, knowing that his experience could help prevent future abuses. One of the first orders of business was addressing the damage done by the leasing program. With the stolen funds recovered from the shell company Evergreen Solutions, the committee worked to repair relationships and compensate those who had suffered. James's storage facility was finally cleared of any lingering claims, and with the help of a few neighbors, he began the painstaking process of reorganizing his belongings. As he sorted through boxes of antiques and keepsakes, he couldn't help but feel a renewed appreciation for the items that had once seemed so precariously lost. Despite the progress, the scars of the ordeal remained. Some neighbors moved away, unwilling to rebuild in a place tainted by mistrust. Others, however, found strength in the crisis, forging new bonds that gave the community a resilience it had never known before. James, though naturally reserved, found himself at the center of this newfound unity. His determination and unwillingness to back down had inspired others, and they looked to him as a voice of reason and integrity. One evening, as James sat on his porch with a glass of bourbon, He reflected on how far he had come. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the air, a comforting reminder of the peace he had fought so hard to reclaim. He thought about the sleepless nights, the threats, the vandalism, all the ways his opponents had tried to break him. Yet here he was, still standing, his property and his principles intact. The final piece of closure came a few days later when Greg Matheson stopped by with an envelope. "I thought you'd want to see this," Greg said, handing it over with a small smile. Inside was a letter from the district attorney's office, confirming that Evelyn and David had accepted plea deals. Both would face prison time and hefty fines, ensuring they would never again wield influence in the community. James nodded as he read the letter, feeling a sense of finality settle over him. As Greg prepared to leave, he turned back with a grin. "You know, James, you could make a career out of this. Neighborhood defender, taking down corrupt boards one by one." James chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I've had enough drama for a lifetime. I'll stick to antiques, they're a lot less trouble." Greg laughed and waved goodbye, leaving James alone with his thoughts. He glanced at the storage facility, its new locks gleaming in the fading light, and felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He had fought for what was his, not just for himself but for his neighbors and their shared sense of security. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. With that, James leaned back in his chair, letting the evening breeze wash over him. The fight was over, but its lessons would stay with him forever. He had faced corruption, intimidation, and uncertainty, and he had come out stronger on the other side. Now he could finally enjoy the peace he had earned, knowing he had stood his ground and prevailed.